All right, so I think we'll go ahead and get started for tonight. I'm Sean Munson. I'm an associate professor here in HCDE, and I'm also a director of the PhD program. And also Julie Kientz, the chair of the department and professor, is joining us as well. And so our plan for tonight is to talk through a little bit about our own research and kind of how that segues into how we mentor students and work with students in that work. And before we do that, just because this is the first of the two research talks, I'm also going to give about a 3-minute overview of the research areas in HCDE. If you have questions, you can raise your hand. We'll have questions after both talks, or you can type them into chat, and we'll also try and get through them there as well. So that's our plan for tonight. And then captioning's on, and this recording will be posted to the HCDE website as well, where the two previous sessions in this preview series are also already posted. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started talking about research in the department. So HCDE has 17 active labs and centers. For a tiny department, we have a pretty big footprint in the university. 58 directed research groups were offered last year, and those are a really nice form of 4-credit research groups that bring together students and faculty across all of our programs, undergrads, master's students, PhD programs, to do research or to read research together. I've really valued it for a way that it helps make sure that our students who are in more practice-oriented programs headed to industry know about and are able to and prepared to work with research, and that those are the students in our PhD program who might be oriented more towards academia or other research institutes are making sure that what they write up and what they share out from their research is accessible and usable to folks in practice as well. So I think it helps really increase the impact of our work. 208 students in the department participated in research last year. We received 22 research grants and about $9.7 million in research funding. So again, a really active and vibrant research program here. We have research labs that different faculty run. And you can kind of read the whole range of things. I am always excited to learn about something new that one of my colleagues is doing, which is just this fantastic diversity of topics and methods and approaches, theories that folks draw on in their work. It's a really vibrant place to be. We also have 2 centers that are led by HCD faculty. COSAR, which is the Center for Collaborative Systems for Security, Safety, and Regional Resilience, led by Professor Mark Hasselkorn, and the Center for Engineering, Learning, and Teaching, KELT, led by Professor Cindy Atman. We're also very active in some larger centers around campus, including the Center for an Informed Public. Kate Starbird is currently the director of that center. Julie Kientz is participating in the Series Center, which is combined with the University of California at Irvine for connecting education tech to the research ecosystem. There's a fantastic community of accessible technology researchers and educators here on campus as well. And Professor Leah Finlater has been super involved in the Create Center as part of that. And then I'm also the methods co-director for the Alacrity Center, which seeks to design mental health interventions to be more accessible and usable. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as part of my research talk. All right, so with that, that's kind of the big umbrella of things that are going on. Now I'm going to drill down and talk a little bit about some of the projects that I've been working on and some of where I go, what I do in my research. And so a lot of my research takes as a departure point that we have all of these fantastic new health sensors and capabilities, connected devices, devices that can be automated to intervene on your behalf as well, ways of aggregating data from yourself, from your electronic health records and other places to know more about your health. And that's exciting, and there's a lot of promise in this, but the actual experience for people is often one of kind of being overwhelmed. Right now, these are not just sensors or devices that support you, but they're also new data sources that you're supposed to attend to and somehow be healthier. And there's this field of personal informatics that talks about how they're supposed to help you, right? You kind of get all these insights from these different tools. That leads to hopefully some sort of knowledge on which you might take action. So you get some inspiration or some awareness, or you get a question answered, and then you act in a way that should hopefully improve your health. A lot of my early work in this space was on techniques for how to take all of that aggregation and actually, rather than just telling you that you have a problem, start looking at ways that you could understand it to say, here's an opportunity to act. So giving people different ways to look at and inspect that data and figure out where within the space of possibilities is there something that would improve their health or their well-being or move them towards some other goal that they're interested in. And this has been, I think, a lot kind of true of a lot of the work in this personal data and personal health data space. But I think there's two things that have been kind of missing from this research area that have been my focus over the last few years, especially. And one of those is a very deep understanding of people's goals and ways to elicit those goals in design, to tailor the experience to match those goals, and to support them as they move toward them or as their goals change. The other piece that I think has been missing is that we call the field personal informatics, but in truth, very little of these experiences are individual or entirely personal, right? The data are very personal, but the experience and the work that people do around them tends to be very shared. So people work with experts like their doctors on it. They work with peers for social support and accountability. They also end up working a lot with their family members, right? So or others with whom they cohabitate. So for example, if you're working on a food goal, the food choices that people at work, that people in your household make, end up having a tremendous influence on your choices and what's possible for you to do as well. And so designing for personal informatics as an individual activity, I think tends to come up short of what people need for the support that they're looking for. And so as I think about this, I often think about this as, or the work that I'm doing now, as understanding and addressing goal misalignments. And those can be misalignments between individuals and the tools they use, or they can be misalignments between people and the people who are trying to support them as they act. And so one of the misalignment patterns that really shows up a lot in personal informatics is this idea that if you don't know someone's goals, just give them more data, right? Like throw data at them, and surely somewhere in there will be the answer. And that's, it's a nice thought, but if you've ever had a lot of data thrown at you, even if you love it, there's probably been a point where you've been overwhelmed or found it frustrating or just too much. And so this often leads to people kind of finding it burdensome, or they're being asked to collect the data themselves. And so they end up abandoning the technologies before they meet their goals. And so much better is to ask people their goals and then scaffold the tracking accordingly. So we've built some apps that are really designed to elicit people's goals. So there's lots of reasons why you might track food, but the default in most tools has been to track calories. And that's often not what people are looking for. And so if we ask them, are you tracking to understand what's irritating your bowels? Are you tracking to improve your mood or something like that? We can build an app that is much more focused around their goals and it doesn't distract them with kind of all these other measures or other types of data and hopefully gets them to where they want to be. We've done some other work in migraine tracking where there's lots of different goals that people can have, and they all require different kinds of effort, different kinds of data to be tracked. And the current trackers that are out there just kind of give people this blank slate and it's like, go for it, right? Track everything. And that also leads to this burden where people are, well, I don't know. And they get tired after a while, especially if they're not getting answers fast enough. And so by asking what people are looking for, we can scaffold their choices about what data they collect, how they collect it, how often they collect it, and how they look at it. And so we're getting ready for a field deployment of this app now, but our expectation is that it will be a much lower burden tool that people are able to stick with, and they're able to get answers that they can make sense of and then act on as a result of their use of it. We've also done things like strip away food journaling to just daily challenges. And there, people are looking to eat healthier, don't necessarily need a data experience. What they want is an experience that makes them a little more connected with their food. And so simply just responding to a daily prompt can be a wonderful way to increase your awareness of what you're eating, have a social experience around it or something like that, but not feel like every meal is now turned into an accounting or spreadsheet project. And it's much closer to the experiences that people would like to have. Another source of misalignment can be from the very people that someone engages to help them. And so we see this a lot where folks are working with their health providers, and health providers are super well-intentioned. They don't have a lot of time. They often don't have a lot of resources to bring to a problem, but they're doing their best for someone. But they're really trained to focus on the health outcomes. So how can we get you to a place where you experience no symptoms or less pain? And that might be a very long-term goal. And what someone is looking for in the moment is how do they have their health not interfere with the other things in their life, like playing with their kids, participating in hobbies that they love. And so the health providers, in focusing on that health endpoint, can end up talking past someone's goals about how do they just live their life in the meantime. And so we've done some really simple interventions, like build questionnaires where people review their data before they go to a visit with the health provider and talk about what they would like to get out of that visit, as well as what they already know, so that that very short 20-minute visit with their doctor can be more effective and can really center where the patient is rather than center what the provider assumes their goal is. Another misalignment is that a lot of the health tools that people use assume one goal, and they tend to have a static assumption of that goal. But people, as they gain information about their health or as other things happen in their life, will experience changes in their goals. We've probably all experienced a time when something related to our health has been a priority, and times when it absolutely can't be because of other things going on for us. And so having tools that evolve with someone's understanding as their goals change and move with them or support moving between tools can really do much better at meeting people where they are and supporting them as they go through this series of steps, rather than treating someone as kind of this static entity who's always trying to do the same thing with the same urgency. So we've designed ecosystems of tools, for example, in understanding the relationship between food and symptoms that help people track, form hypotheses, and then move on to testing very specific things. All right, so that's a lot of the work I've been doing in health tracking. Thanks to the students I work with who kind of pull me into these other spaces, I've been broadening beyond this a bit some lately. And so one expansion of this concept has been to take some of the goal-directed self-tracking work we've done and apply that same principle to digital well-being. And so lots of folks have kind of this love-hate relationship with one or more of their technologies. They love the value that it adds for them. They like that it can help them do things, but they also find that they're doing things that they don't mean to on there. They're getting distracted, they're doom scrolling, they're reading rather than posting or something like that. And so also a lot of tools have been built to help people manage their technology use. But the primary measure for that has been time. How do we have you on that device or on that app only at certain times of day, or to maximize the amount of time you have on it over the course of a week? That's a really poor proxy for the richness of people's goals. So if someone wants to connect with people more on a platform, so they want to send more direct messages to a friend, or they want to have more calls, but they set a time limit because of their doom scrolling or kind of they're just endless scrolling of the feed, the system isn't going to be able to differentiate between those two things. And so it's not going to really be attuned to what someone's trying to get out of it. And so with PhD student Kai Lukoff and Alexis Hineker in the iSchool, we've been working on ways that we can better measure whether someone's managing their device use in a way they want to, and design things that actually support their use in a way that they want, that aren't really kind of just these time-based interventions. Two other expansions have been to look at tracking in even more collaborative settings. So far, a lot of the spaces I've looked at tracking have been really centering the individual and their goals, and then thinking about kind of the ecosystem of folks around them who are supporting it. So lately, I've been looking at kind of more team situations, and that can include collegiate athletics, where yes, there's the individual athlete, but there's also the team goals, there's team staff, coaches, and others. And often what an individual wants can be somewhat in tension with what the team needs, and also in tension with what the individual wants in their non-athletic life, right? So someone might be faced with, well, the team says you're supposed to sleep to rest up for a game, but you want to socialize, or you want to do well and get ready for an exam the next day in the student part of your life. And that all ends up being a place where tracking has tremendously disrupted the ways that people have dealt with that in the past. And workplace tracking comes up as another space where in theory, workplaces are saying we're going to track to help you be more productive, but it becomes a tool of surveillance and control as well. And needs a lot more research to figure out if it can even be deployed in good ways. And then finally, we've been looking at smart home devices as a source of personal data traces lately as well. So smart home cameras, doorbell cameras, nanny cameras, dash cams. And this also ends up going right back to the workplace challenge, because many of these cameras end up surveilling gig workers, delivery drivers, nannies. And so these are another place where personal data traces are less about you and more kind of in the surveillance and power space that has been interesting to me lately. Last two things I'll mention are I've also been working on a translational science of human-centered design and human-computer interaction, including models that help us better understand how work gets from academia into practice, and also living some of that work by trying to translate what we do in human-centered design to the design of mental health interventions through the Alacrity Center that I mentioned earlier, where there's been this tremendous investment in high quality, effective mental health interventions. But once they kind of leave the research setting, the uptake and their deployment is not as broad as we would hope for that investment. And the hypothesis of the center is basically that human-centered design concepts like usability are actually what's interfering with effective uptake of these mental health interventions. And so we're trying to understand ways that human-centered design can not just understand the problem, but ameliorate it and get those interventions out to being used by more people. I do this work with a tremendous number of students. So lots of great current PhD students in HCDE, as well as computer science and engineering, lots of fantastic collaborators and co-advisors on this work. I kind of take the view that I want to prepare students to do work that I couldn't do myself. And so that often means working with other faculty and other collaborators as well as lots of alumni who are out there in the world continuing to do this work, as well as their own kind of building their own research agendas that are, it's fun to see at conferences and the directions they're going. I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. But for now, I'll just also note some funders who were funded by NSF, as well as lots of health agencies, and then turn it over to Julie.
Thanks, Sean. Let me get my screen up. Oh, okay, there we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like, you have to stop sharing first. Okay. All right. All right. Can folks see that? Okay, everyone can see? Okay, great. So hi, everybody. My name is Julie Kientz. I'm a professor in human-centered design engineering. I'm also a department chair, so you might have seen my name in a couple places. This slide is my one slide overview. So if you're only going to sort of take notes on one slide, this would have most of it on here. So my primary research areas are in human-computer interaction and interaction design in children. I also touch on computer-supported cooperative work and health informatics as well too. And so my research lab is called the CHILL Lab. It stands for Computing for Healthy Living and Learning Lab. We are actually working on rebranding it to add inclusive in there as well too, to get the full CHILL name in there as well, also to recognize the new work that we're doing around health inequities. So our mission is to design, develop, and evaluate novel computing applications to support individuals and families in pursuing their health and education goals. So like Sean, I have a number of collaborators, including Sean, and a number of collaborators at Seattle Children's, computer science, information school, public health, school of nursing, sleep medicine, and psychiatry and behavioral sciences. And so I have a number of current students working in my lab, as well as a number of alumni whose work you'll see in the next few slides. And so I'm going to kind of go over these projects down at the bottom. And so you'll see more of these here. So before I get started into the specific projects, I kind of want to give you just an overall approach to my research. So I'm very motivated by the human-centered design process. Sorry, I just realized that you're not seeing my camera. There we are. Hi, everyone. I think I went back. Okay, there we go. There. Okay. So we are motivated by the human-centered design process as a whole and wanting to understand first, before we design any new technologies, understanding the need or the lack of need for any type of design or technology intervention in a specific space and how those design choices might impact people. So my lab uses a very mixed method approach. So we use a lot of social science informed methods for, in that early stage of understanding problems, needs, and the different design constraints. We design new things for generating ideas and prototypes. We might use qualitative methods early on as we're evaluating prototypes in the beginning for things like acceptability and feasibility. We then might start to do experimental methods for evaluating outcomes. And then, across all that work, thinking about applying and generating theory through multiple areas and approaches. So the main areas in which I publish my work are primarily in the human-computer interaction research space. So that includes the CHI conference, CCW, TOCA, UBComp. A lot of my work has been moving into the interaction design in children's space. That's the IDC conference and the Child Computer Interaction Journal. The health informatics space includes the AMIA conference as well as the JAMIA and JBI journals. And then also because I collaborate with a number of health or education collaborators, we've also been publishing some of the work more focused in that space in journals, medical journals relevant to those communities. So now I'm going to go through a number of different research projects really fast to kind of give you the 10,000 foot view of the projects going on in my lab. I'm going to kind of do them slightly in order of oldest to most recent. Not precisely, but kind of just to give you a feel of kind of the evolution of some of the work in my lab. And then I'll go over some of the things I'm looking for new students coming in this year. So I have a long history, like Sean, doing some work with personal informatics and health informatics. We had a large research grant focusing on novel technologies in the sleep space. And so we did a number of different technologies. The first one is called Sleep Tight, which was looking at self-monitoring of behavioral sleep disruptors using a really low burden process. And so the idea here is that to log things like caffeine intake or rest or medication, it's pretty onerous to open up an app and kind of enter all the information here. So we were experimenting with things like lock screen widgets that would allow you to just do one tap logging of things right from the main screen of your phone, and then what kinds of information that we could gather from people to help them understand what behavioral things that they were doing that might impact their sleep. We did another project looking more at environmental sleep disruptors. So this was a prototype of a sleep sensing device that would be next to the bedside table that also included a sensor suite of a temperature, light, noise, and motion sensors to capture sort of what happens in the bedroom environment. And so we had a little bedside display that would capture your night's sleep and allow you to go back and review graphs of where you're, and then we had people wear a sleep sensing device, and we were able to allow people to understand what the light conditions and the temperature conditions are when they were having good sleep versus not so good sleep, and then using that to try and understand what sorts of things were disrupting their sleep. A more recent project in the sleep space was motivated by the fact that most people, and this is something we learned from the Lullaby study, is that most people do not sleep alone in their household, and that family constraints actually play a huge role in people's ability to get healthy sleep. And so this was work led by Laura Pina alongside some of the co-design team with kids team to working with kids and families to develop a family-based sleep tracking tool. And so the idea was that families could view and rest each other's sleep, and then have different activities in which they could learn about each other's sleep habits and have conversations about them as a family. So this also was thinking about how we could think about distributing tracking across different members of the household, and also empower kids to think about their own participation and view of health. Another project not related to sleep, but was sort of motivated by some of the sleep stuff, is the idea that many people have questions that they want to ask about their health that just showing them graphs of their data can't necessarily answer. And so we worked with a gastroenterologist to help understand how we can develop technology to support mini experiments to identify health triggers related to irritable bowel syndrome. So this was designing little mini N of 1 trials for things like eating caffeine or not having caffeine, and understanding what that did to your symptoms throughout the day, and then helping people draw conclusions about whether or not potential food triggers were a source of their abdominal pain or their bloating or other sorts of symptoms. A lot of that work in that space led us to think specifically around this concept that kept coming up again and again as we did all these technology deployments, which was around this concept of user burden. So with Munson, Nina Shariari, and Eric Heckler, we worked on developing a specific model of user burden that ended up understanding 6 different constructs around how user burden plays out in technology systems, specifically in the health space. And so along with that model, we developed a validated scale. So this is motivated by some of my work with the health communities and trying to understand how we can essentially measure user burden in these systems that we were designing for. So also I apologize if you hear my kids in the background. 1 second. The work from home thing. I did work with kids all the time too, so I'm used to it, but I know a lot of people aren't. So anyway, we've developed this user burden scale that allows people to measure how much user burden is present, people perceive to be present within their system. And so just, it was a 6 subscales of 2 to 4 questions each. And this allows us to look at things like this. So we did a big validation study with this. So for example, we asked people about the different burdens associated with different devices. And so for example, here's what people associated the user burden of Fitbit. And so the blue line indicates their score if they were still currently using the device, and the orange indicates if they had abandoned the device. And so you can see that the people who abandoned the device ended up finding it much more difficult to use than the people who were still using it. However, for the people that were still, or if it was a financial burden as well too, they were more likely to stop using it. So for example, losing it and not being able to afford to replace it. But for people who are using it, they did still feel, some of these other burdens were less. The physical burden of wearing it was actually higher, and the time and social burden was more as well too. So moving on to other projects. So also this one is also Sean. So thinking a lot about how to deliver different types of interventions through, again, through these kind of low burden ways of connecting with people. So we use the Slack platform, which is which we call an asynchronous remote communities platform, to deliver a specific type of intervention with teens. And so we brought groups of teens onto a Slack server and engaged them in activities through the behavior activation intervention for treating mild to moderate depression, and thought about how we can use things like chatbots, peer communities, interactions with clinicians to help bring communities together through to support teens' mental health. Another recent project was exploring how families were navigating COVID-19 and the technologies that were the technology used during that, and especially in the early pandemic. So this is partially motivated by my own experience of being at home with my children and seeing this rapid transition to remote learning. And it failing spectacularly with my pre-kindergarten son at the time in the very beginning, and feeling such empathy for pre-K teachers who had no experience with any remote learning or trying to use tools that were not in any way designed for 4-year-olds to be able to use, and thinking that we could do a much better job, and that we should understand what's going on here. So we recruited 10 families across the US to engage with us through an asynchronous remote communities method. So we use Slack to bring 10 different groups, or 3 groups of 10 families each, to come together and do weekly activities, sort of reflecting on how they were experiencing this during the pandemic, and also for the last part of that, doing some co-design. So we had families work together through the study to help us design new technologies, both related to educational technology, but then also related to how they could help them return to the real world. I think everybody was really excited about COVID vaccines being delivered by drones, for example, and other sorts of things. Lastly is a long-term project that I've been working on. around helping parents track and understand their children's development and connect them with intervention, potential early intervention resources. And so this is a very long history of this project that has looked at everything from web platforms to text messaging to social media platforms, to think through how we can use technology in the space of developmental screening and connecting parents to resources. This recent work has been picked up by my current student, Kayla DeWitt, who's reevaluating a lot of this technology through a health equity lens. And so we ran a pretty big study of baby steps a couple of years ago and found that, while it was helpful for all the parents in our study, we actually saw that it was even more helpful for people who are on the higher socioeconomic portion of our population. And so trying to sort of think through how we can redesign the technology to help narrow that gap in health equity as opposed to growing it further. So kind of thinking about the future and you all, I thought I'd talk a little bit about who I'm looking to admit to my lab in 2022. As Sean mentioned in the beginning, I was recently the UW lead on the UC Irvine and Jacobs Foundation Series Center, which is focused on bringing together people who work in the education and children's technology space across many different universities. So UC Irvine, UW, Carnegie Mellon's involved. I think Berkeley's involved. There's a number of different universities associated with this network. And so we have funding for fellows that will be associated with this center. So I'm looking for a student who really wants to engage with the work of the center and communicate with that and collaborate with other researchers in this space. So I'm looking for a PhD student who wants to work directly with children. This is in collaboration with Alexis Hinnicker and Jason Yip in the Information School. Jason runs a really wonderful kids co-design team called Kids Team, where we get messy and we collaborate with kids. And we put up with kids' very pointed critiques of our technology ideas and their wild and wonderful ideas. So I'm really excited to work with somebody who is excited about working with kids. There's 5 research areas associated with the Series Center, and it's pretty open-ended on the topics there, but the 5 ones are looking at the new digital divide, accessible education, computer-supported collaborative learning, which includes some of the family health informatics that I mentioned earlier around the family sleep tracking, algorithmic education, and evidence-based digital learning. Other sorts of things you might want to know about my mentoring approach. So my approach to mentoring is that you are people first, not PhD students. I very much care about you as a person, and my goal is to help you meet your educational and research goals. Hopefully we'll do some really awesome and fun research along the way, but my goal is to support you as a student. The other thing is, if you want to work with me, you better love collaboration, because that is the core of what I do. You saw in many of my slides, there was not a single presentation that probably had fewer than 3 or 4 people involved. And I'm a really big fan of doing collaborative work. It makes the projects more fun. It makes it more less lonely. It makes it better because there's multiple people working on the project. Also a strong proponent of work-life balance. I expect you to have a life outside of the lab. And co-advising is both possible and encouraged where it makes sense. And lastly, what you should think about, people who do well with me in my lab, or people who are passionate about designing technology that can make a difference. Students who are self-motivated, I want you to be excited about your work. And I want you to, and not everything you'll do will be fun, I promise. There's always like parts of any project that are kind of a little bit boring, but hopefully you are self-motivated to do the work. I really love working with students who have a strong sense of curiosity about things relating to people and technology. Students who are really open-minded and have a growth mindset around project topics and methods, and are willing to try new things is really great. And as I mentioned, are really collaborative with others. So that's what I have. And Sean, do we have time for questions? I don't know what the format is. So
about 15 minutes or so for your questions. You can post them into chat, or you can go ahead and raise a hand. So I see a question from David. You can, I think, just unmute yourself and ask.
Hi, thank you, Julie and Sean. And I have 2 questions actually. So first question, I wonder, like, when you guys work with kids, or how do you make sure that kids understand the concept or the technology concept that you show them? And then the other question is related to like the dream catcher that Julie mentioned. Like, how do the family members make sense of their sleep data when they get it? And are there any discussion about changing their maybe sleep behavior and stuff like that?
Thanks. Sorry, I got distracted by my son who was trying on his Halloween costume. He is an apple tree. Thanks for your questions, David. So I think your first one was around kind of thinking through how do we design with kids and how do we kind of understand the kind of like concepts and things. So it actually really depends on the age of the kids. So with really younger kids, often we're sort of using their parents and alongside them and having them help with us and or work with us and make it really kind of comfortable for them. You know, we may only get like kind of really high level things. Alexis Hineker, one of my former students and now a collaborator, also innovated on some really great ways of using things like comic boarding to help kids understand through story-based and play-based interactions how they can learn and participate in technology. On the older side of the spectrum, you know, kids have a much better idea sometimes of what technologies are. They may not always know what's possible technically, which actually is part of the fun. So some of our job as researchers is take their wild ideas of putting jetpacks on everyone and translate into something. Okay, what they're really asking for is freedom or autonomy. The jetpack is sort of a metaphor. They want to be able to go out and explore. And so some of it's on the design team to sort of interpret what kids think and how we can relate to them. And can you repeat your second question, David?
Yes, thank you. And for the second question is related to the dream catcher. So I wonder like when like how do family members make sense of their sleep data when they get it? And then were there any discussion about changing their behaviors when they get like the result?
Yeah, I probably won't have time to get into all the details because it's pretty rich. But you know, in general, I think the kids were pretty great proponents of sleep tracking, and they're pretty smart. So kids can make sense of things sometimes more so than adults do. But yeah, there were some questions I think in kind of understanding the importance of like, why does dad need less sleep than I do, right? You know, some of those questions around development and things along those lines came up in that study. But it was also just interesting things about, you know, parents aren't always used to having their data shown to their children, right? So interesting kind of privacy concerns within the family, and like this kind of shared power was also uncomfortable for some families who had more of a hierarchical system. So it's kind of like flattening the structure within the family. So we had them all just wear Fitbits for tracking their data. We didn't do anything fancy with the tracking overall. So it's kind of individual sleep behaviors and kind of looking at overall trends there. Great, thanks for your questions.
Other questions? Yes, Jaewon.
Yeah, so thank you for your talk. I have a question for Professor Munson. You mentioned goal misalignments and many different cases of such misalignments. So to judge whether there is a misalignment or not, I would assume that you first had to define which goal belongs to what category. Like, is this a solely health-related goal, or is it something broader than that? And I'm curious whether there were any difficulties you faced. Like, were there any cases where participants had multiple goals? Were the participants able to clearly define their goals in the first place? And were there any like personal variants, individual differences in terms of how broad or narrow the goals are? Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think goals are messy, right? Like we want them to be clean, right? And often a lot of the literature in goal setting is about how you get to, what they call like these SMART goals that are specific, measurable, actionable, relatable, and timely, right? But that's not where people start, right? Is they start with, this is a problem and I want it to be different, right? Or I have this aspiration. And so in the migraine app, a lot of what we're having to do is scaffold from this open-ended thing that people write into, is there a category that sounds kind of right? And then trying to get more specific. So the actual setup process is designed to try and walk someone through it. And importantly, I think to also say, okay, this is actually not a goal that can be supported by this app, right? So if we can't support what they're trying to do, can we send them somewhere else, or at least not waste their time? think the other part of your question that I really resonate with is, do people have multiple goals? And absolutely, right? And they have multiple goals that are related to the thing that we're doing or trying to support in their health, right? So they might be, long-term trying to reduce their symptoms, short-term trying to just understand and predict them so that they can manage the rest of life around it. But that's also alongside things that are kind of adjacent to it, like they want to eat delicious foods, or they don't want to give up some things they love, or they want to be able to participate socially, right? Like a very restricted diet, unfortunately, can often mean that it's hard to participate when friends go out to a restaurant or when you have a work lunch or something like that. And so I think a lot of where we tried to facilitate that in patient-provider collaboration was having people talk about the trade-offs they were willing to make between them, with kind of an understanding that the trade-off you might make today is not the same as tomorrow. And so we'd see things like providers starting to put people onto very restricted diets because they knew that would reduce the symptoms. Again, it's a real focus on the health kind of objective there. And so I say, wait, I already don't get to eat a lot. It's important to me not to take these things out of the diet. And then sometimes that would be like flicking a switch, and all of a sudden the conversation would change to, oh, so rather than telling you not to eat these things, I'm going to tell you how you can cook the things that you like with other foods, or a process that leaches out the sugars that cause your particular symptoms. And so, yeah, having people be able to talk about multiple goals in parallel seemed to lead to better collaboration that would unlock this other expertise that the provider had, but just wasn't knowing to share, for example.
It must be very difficult to define the scope of research for all like design and human-centered research problems.
Yeah, right. And sometimes the answer isn't technology, right, or something like that. This is also, I think, to kind of borrow something from that I think Julie put better at one point to me, was it's really good to work with the medical collaborators because they can kind of hold us honest to chasing what's a real problem for people, rather than what's technically interesting, though sometimes it leads us out of the technology space. Though I've also had to learn that sometimes what the providers focused on is not what their patients are focused on. And so trying to figure out how to listen to all of that and find a space among them from design.
I see. Thank you for your insight.
Other questions? Colin, am I saying your name right?
Yes, and I have a more general scope question for both.
Yes.
For both professors. I would like to know what that collaborative advising looks like. I've heard about that a bit from different professors and reading about students. I'd really like to hear what that looks like in this program.
You want to take that on, Sean, or I can? It doesn't matter.
Yeah, Julie and I work together a lot, so
I know.
I think our answers might not be that different. I think a lot of it is, there's different kinds of collaborative advising. And so sometimes it's kind of known from the start that someone wants to be in this space, that's a project that both of us are already on, or me and someone else are already on. And that can kind of just be like, okay, that's the plan from the get-go. I think other times it occurs more organically where, for example, I was working with Neely Tan, a PhD student, on the smart homes and cameras project. And very quickly we realized that some of the methods that Neely wanted to use and some of the ways that Neely was thinking about data were a stretch from methods that I know and from the ways that I think about data. And so we did a couple of things. One is Neely and some other students pulled together a reading group so that I could start learning about methods that were new to me, which was awesome and fun. And I got to be a student again. But we also pulled in Audrey Desjardins in the School of Art History and Design, who is much more knowledgeable about speculative design methods, and what they can bring to a research problem, and also had been doing this work on kind of data at home already. And so brought in this whole other set of literature and has really strengthened the work, made it more fun for me, right? It's different. And I think, right, has really supported Neely in having kind of these multiple mentors and perspectives to draw on. And we'll do things kind of, logistically, like how often do we meet? Sometimes students will be in a place where they want to meet separately. Other times it can make sense to meet together every week. So the added challenge, I think, of collaborative advising is often that you hear multiple perspectives, which is an advantage because you're always shown that there's not one way to do things. But it also can be, challenging because it puts a little more on you to navigate among the different perspectives, to schedule with multiple faculty and things like that. But I think it just overall, we're a place without very many boundaries. And so between disciplines or between ways of knowing, one of the things that we hire on when we hire faculty is disciplinary agility. So people who can embrace and see ways of knowing beyond their own space. And I think the collaborative advising kind of takes advantage of the best of that. What did I miss?
No, I think that's a good coverage of that. So yeah, usually it makes sense if it's, complementary, right? So I am sort of a jack of all trades when it comes to methods. So if you want really in-depth like expertise on like quantitative methods or research through design, I might recommend that you have a co-advisor who has more expertise in a specific method, or domain expertise, for example, too. So one of my students is kind of being co-advised actually by someone outside of HCDE who has specific expertise about health equity and pediatrics. So and so kind of adding pieces of that, adding connections to the clinicians and the clinical work. So connections to community partners. So sort of thinking through, what makes sense there. So it's great because, sometimes you get multiple people who are there to answer your questions, but then sometimes it ends up being, scheduling is tricky, or if they're really different perspectives, then you might have conflicting opinions about things. So, you usually I'm pretty open and with the students that I work with, and I can clearly admit my faults and where my knowledge gaps lie, which can go really well with co-advising relationships, because I was like, you should talk to your other advisor because they'll know way more than I do about that. So
thank you so much for providing those insights. I really appreciate it.
Sejal.
Hi. Hi to both of the professors and everyone. I just have a question regarding to Professor Julie. My question is about when we say children, and can we also discuss about children and the elderly people, because I believe that both of these categories or these group of people have kind of similar psychology, because they are growing and they are getting old. So do you have any thoughts on that?
I actually just have a recently graduated student. I didn't have a chance to include her work in here, but she worked on designing health technologies for older adults, and we were actually inspired by Kids Team. So a method of co-design where you build relationships with young children and acknowledge the power differential that can happen between adult designers and children, and try to apply and extend those methods to the other side of the age spectrum. The students I'm working for going forward, so the series center that I mentioned is specifically focused on youth, but there might be some interesting projects around connecting youth with older adults. So I've always thought it was really great that my parents are very motivated by hanging out with my children, their grandchildren. And so there's just something special about that kind of younger child and grandparent connection that can be really kind of interesting around from a family perspective. So there's lots of really great and awesome work in that side of the spectrum.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah. Any last questions for tonight?
Yeah, happy to answer other questions about kind of just the PhD program in general too. I think Sean's the current PhD chair, and I've been in that role in the past as well too. So we probably have a good amount of knowledge for that.
Josie.
Yes, hi, hello. Okay, good, you can hear me. I'm new to this whole raising my hand and unmuting thing. My question revolves sort of around, I guess for both of you really, around the idea of tech accessibility, because I like thinking about how whether or not someone has access and what that access looks like affects how they interact with the tech that they might have available to them, and how that sort of impacts your research and how you might be able to consider those different realms of, availability to all different age groups.
I can talk a little bit about that. So, I think accessibility and inclusion and aspects of that, more broadly speaking, are definitely a big part of what a lot of us do in HCDE, and kind of understanding, the access issue for sure. there's a big group of people on campus. So Leah Finlater's the closest one in HCDE who's working with the CREATE Center that Sean mentioned in the beginning. So that's specifically focused on people with disabilities and access to technology for people with disabilities. I know Sean and I, as well as I think Gary Shea, are also looking at, and Beth Kolko as well too, have been looking at sort of health technologies from an equity lens going forward. And so sort of thinking through how do we design for people who have been historically marginalized, and how can we make sure that we design for them first, as opposed to designing for the broader population first and hoping that it works for them, because I think we've learned that doesn't work so well. And so a lot of people are working through that. And so there is some of this tension that Sean kind of alluded to this as well too, around sometimes the newest and the flashiest technologies are what's the most exciting, but they're also the least accessible. So things like, there's some really cool like tech interventions in the virtual reality space, but those headsets just aren't affordable for most people beyond the early adopters at this point. And so sort of thinking through this tension between designing for access now versus sort of like designing for 10 years in the future. Maybe in 10 years in the future it will be. So sometimes there's some tensions around sort of the target of where you're sort of thinking through the design and research space. But we're all, no, I don't think we have any clear answers, but we're certainly all working on a lot of questions there. So it's a great question. Sean, do you have anything to add, or?
Yeah, just that it's, as Julie mentioned, I'm really glad that I have colleagues who have more expertise than me in this, who can help think through it. And I'm glad that I am in a department that values access to our technology, so that I'm not pressured to always make the flashiest or newest thing, but to really think about what the impact of the work that we're doing is for the people we're working with.
That's incredible. Thank you both so much.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for your question.
All right, other questions? Joanne.
I have a question to Julie. You mentioned that you're kind of a jack of all trades in terms of research methodologies. I'm curious whether you tried multiple research methodologies during your PhD, or was it something that you picked up while advising other students? Because I did a research on detecting subtle malingering of adult ADHD using smartphone sensors. Then I got interested in building a social media that introverts would also be comfortable with. And I felt that what I learned from my first research project doesn't really apply to the second one that much, at least in terms of like research methodologies. So I'm curious how you are managing all that. Yeah.
Yes, and yes to your question. So yes, I definitely used mixed methods in my PhD work. And yes, I've definitely learned a lot more as I've gone along, and I'm still learning, right? New methods are also evolving as research goes on. So even and Sean can talk about this too, even the PhD committee has been sort of rethinking about all their methods courses in HCDE. Traditionally it's been sort of like quantitative and qualitative methods, but now we have sort of design methods, we have engineering methods, there's a lot of other methods beyond sort of the standard scientific methods. And so, I definitely acknowledge that there's a lot to be learned from all of those methods, and it really depends on the questions that we're asking. I often tell students that, like the quantitative may tell us the what, like what's happening, or what did it work? And the qual often tells us the why. And I would never do a study of just quant without that qual, because I have collaborated with a researcher who did only quant, and it was really frustrating to me because we found this really interesting result, but we had no idea why. And so I've been a big proponent of having mixed methods, of like at least have like a one question open-ended survey to the participants in the study, because we didn't know how to explain that really interesting result without participant information. So always learning, always recognizing that different types of questions require different answers, or different types of methods to answer those questions. And sometimes the part of the fun is sort of thinking through what's the best method for the types of questions that we have. That's a lot of the work that we do in our lab.
Advice to a lot of the students I work with is that take as many methods courses as you can early, because they'll just add to this toolbox that you can draw on when you encounter a question and you're like, oh, I really want to answer it. And if you have that method available to help answer it in a way that would be engaging to you, super valuable.
I'll look forward to it. Thank you.
All right, so I notice we're coming up right to time. So I just want to thank you all for your questions, for coming out tonight. Feel free to follow up with us or Kathleen if you've got specific questions that aren't answered by this. And we'll also have one more presentation in this research series from Nadia Peak and Beth Kolko, and that one will be only live. They asked to have a candid conversation that isn't recorded, so you can see the website for how to RSVP for that. I will post the link into chat in a second. Thanks all for coming out tonight, or whatever time it is for you.
Thank you, everybody, and apologize if my kids are a little loud in the background. My dog has also made an appearance as well too. The cat's missing somewhere; he's around, but I appreciate you listening and coming. And thanks to Sean for organizing and Kathleen.
All right, thank you so much.
And the links in chat if you need it.
I think most
Great.
people have left by now.
Yeah.
Hopefully it's the same one they use
Yeah,
for.
Right, it's the same one you got here with, so, but just in
Yeah,
case.
yeah,
All right,
great.
have a good night all.
Bye, everyone.